The champagne flute felt like a shard of ice in Julian Vance's hand, a stark contrast to the simmering heat coiling in his gut. He stood near the edge of the grand ballroom, a ghost in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, observing the glittering spectacle of the Sterling family's annual foundation gala. It was an ocean of old money and inherited power, and he was an island of new ambition about to be annexed. A figure detached itself from a laughing cluster of men who all shared the same tailor and the same easy, predatory smile. Tristan Sterling, heir to the Sterling Empire, a man who had been born on third base and was currently strutting as if he'd hit a grand slam. He moved with the unearned confidence of a dynasty, his blonde hair perfectly coiffed, his blue eyes holding a dismissive, glacial sheen. Tristan stopped in front of him, his gaze flicking over Julian's tuxedo with an air of faint amusement, as if inspecting a piece of furniture he was considering buying. "You the new guy from finance?" Tristan asked, his voice a lazy drawl that dripped with condescension. He didn't wait for an answer. "Grab me another one of these, would you? And tell the bartender to go heavier on the gin this time." The last one tasted like bathwater. He thrust his empty glass toward Julian's chest. Julian's mind went white-hot for a fraction of a second. The urge to let the flute slip from his own fingers, to let it shatter on the marble floor between them, was a physical force. "He thinks I'm the help." The thought was both insulting and, in a twisted way, clarifying. This was the man whose family was about to enter into a $1.2 billion partnership with his company. This was the man who would sit on the new joint board. And he couldn't even be bothered to recognize the face of his new partner, the CEO of Nexus Innovations, the man who held the entire deal in the palm of his hand. Julian looked from Tristan's arrogant face to the empty glass. Every instinct screamed at him to correct the record, to introduce himself with the full weight of his title and watch the smug expression melt from Tristan's face. But he couldn't. He couldn't because this wasn't just about his pride. It was about the Vance Initiative. It was about the half-finished steel skeleton of the community center on the corner of 8th and Elm, the one that stood on the same block where his childhood apartment had been. It was about the tech scholarships for kids who saw a laptop as a lifeline, not a toy. It was about the free clinic his mother had dreamed of before she died, a dream he had sworn to build in her memory. All of it, every single brick and scholarship and stethoscope, was funded by the projected profits from this deal. The deal with the Sterlings. If he spooked them now, if his pride cost his community its future, he would never forgive himself. His mother's disappointed face, a memory he carried like a stone in his heart, flashed in his mind. So he swallowed the fire in his throat. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the rigid set of his shoulders to relax. He manufactured a polite, impersonal smile, the kind of smile that made him invisible, a part of the seamless service. "Of course, Mr. Sterling," Julian said, his voice level, betraying none of the storm within. He took the empty glass. Tristan didn't even say thank you. He just clapped Julian on the shoulder, a gesture of casual ownership, and turned back to his friends, already laughing at some shared joke. Julian stood there for a moment, the cold glass in one hand, his own full flute in the other. He was the architect of a tech empire that was reshaping the digital landscape, a man courted by governments and lauded by industry titans. And in this room, to this man, he was just an errand boy. The humiliation was a bitter acid. He walked toward the bar, each step a carefully controlled movement. He felt the eyes of other guests on him, people who knew who he was, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They saw the exchange. They saw the CEO of Nexus Innovations being treated like a waiter, and they did nothing. This was the world he was trying to conquer, a world that looked at his skin, at his lack of a dynastic surname, and saw a servant, no matter how many billions his company was worth. He reached the bar and placed Tristan's glass on the polished mahogany. "Another gin and tonic for Mr. Sterling," he told the bartender, his voice a low murmur. "Make it strong." The bartender, a man with tired eyes who had likely seen 1,000 Tristan Sterlings in his lifetime, simply nodded. Julian didn't wait. He turned and walked away, melting into the shadows at the edge of the room, his mind racing. This deal had to go through. It was too important. But at what cost? How much of himself would he have to erase to see it done? He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his foundation's director. He needed an update, a reminder of what was at stake. A text message was already there, sent 20 minutes ago. Julian, we have a problem. Councilman Miller just put a freeze on the 8th Street permits. Indefinitely. He's not returning our calls. Julian's blood ran cold. Councilman Miller, a man whose campaigns had been quietly funded by Sterling-owned shell corporations for years. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a power play. They were squeezing him before the ink was even dry, reminding him who was in control. The glass in his hand trembled. He looked across the room at Tristan Sterling, now holding his fresh drink, laughing without a care in the world. The game had changed. This was no longer just about swallowing his pride. It was about survival. Julian Vance had not become who he was by accident. His journey had been forged in the crucible of a world designed to overlook him. He was born in Northwood, a part of the city the news helicopters only flew over when something was on fire. His childhood was a patchwork of food stamps, second-hand clothes, and the unwavering belief of his mother, Sarah, who worked 2 jobs and still found time to read to him every night. His father, a good man broken by a system that saw him as disposable, had worked at the local auto plant for 20 years. He'd left for his shift one Tuesday morning and never came home, the victim of a faulty machine the company had refused to replace. The settlement was an insult, barely enough to cover the funeral. Julian was 10. He remembered holding his father's old watch, a simple, steel-cased timepiece with a cracked crystal, feeling its weight, the silence of its stopped hands a metaphor for his own life. That watch became his talisman. It was a tangible link to the man he'd lost and a constant, ticking reminder that time was the one resource he couldn't afford to waste. While other kids were playing ball, Julian was in the library, devouring books on physics and code. He was a prodigy, a ghost in the city's failing school system, his brilliance a secret kept between him and the dog-eared pages of advanced calculus texts. He learned early that there were 2 sets of rules, one for people who looked like him and came from his neighborhood, and another for everyone else. He was told to be realistic, to aim for a trade, to be grateful for any opportunity. But his mother saw the fire in his eyes. "Don't you let them make you small, Julian," she would say, her voice fierce. "Your mind is a gift. You show them. You show them all." And he did. He earned a full scholarship to MIT, an escape pod from the gravity of his circumstances. He was an outsider there, too, surrounded by legacy students and the casual wealth of families like the Sterlings. He was quieter, hungrier. He didn't go to parties. He lived in the computer labs, fueled by cheap coffee and an unyielding drive to build something that would last, something that couldn't be taken from him. He founded Nexus Innovations in his dorm room with 2 other scholarship kids who shared his vision. Their first product, a revolutionary data compression algorithm, was so elegant, so disruptive, that it made them millionaires before they'd even graduated. But for Julian, it was never about the money itself. It was about what money could do. It was about power. The power to build, to protect, to rewrite the rules. Nexus grew into a behemoth, built on Julian's core principles: merit over pedigree, innovation over tradition, and an almost fanatical dedication to ethical practices. He hired the brilliant and the overlooked, creating a corporate culture that was a direct repudiation of the exclusionary world he'd fought so hard to escape. Now, he was on the precipice of his greatest achievement. The partnership with Sterling Industries wasn't just a business deal. It was a hostile takeover of the past by the future. The Sterlings, with their vast, slow-moving industrial empire, needed his company's agility and tech to survive in the new century. They were a dinosaur, and he was the meteor. At least, that's what he had believed. The Sterling family, he was quickly learning, was a special breed of predator. Their power was not just in their wealth, but in the deep, entangled roots of their influence. They had owned politicians, judges, and journalists for generations. Their name was a key that opened any door and a shield that deflected any consequence. Alastair Sterling, the patriarch, was a man carved from granite and old grudges. He had inherited the empire and viewed himself as its steward, a king defending his realm. In their initial meetings, he had been deceptively cordial, speaking of synergy and mutual respect. But Julian saw the cold calculation in his eyes. To Alastair, Julian was not a partner. He was a tool, a necessary but distasteful acquisition. And then there was Tristan. Tristan was the embodiment of the dynasty's decline. He possessed all of his father's arrogance, but none of his cunning. He saw the world as his personal playground. He treated the staff at Sterling Tower with a casual cruelty that made Julian's skin crawl. He would berate baristas, mock janitors, and take credit for the work of his subordinates without a flicker of shame. During a tense negotiation session weeks earlier, Julian had watched Tristan publicly humiliate a young female analyst who had found a minor error in his financial projections. Tristan had called her honey and told her to stick to making coffee. The woman had shrunk under the assault, her brilliant observation lost in the casual misogyny of the moment. Julian had made a mental note of her name. He'd had his HR department reach out to her with a job offer at Nexus the very next day. She had accepted immediately. This was the family he was about to bind himself to, a family whose values were a cancer to everything he had built. The system they represented was what he was fighting against. The closed boardroom doors, the backroom handshakes, the unspoken agreements that kept power consolidated in the hands of the few. It was a world that ran on nepotism and prejudice, a system that had crushed his father and countless others. By signing this deal, he was supposed to be infiltrating it, changing it from the inside. But as he stood in the shadows of their opulent ballroom, holding a text message that was a thinly veiled threat, he wondered if he was the one being infiltrated. Was he changing the system, or was it just absorbing him, forcing him to play by its corrupt rules until he became just another part of the machine? The memory of his early, anonymous contribution to the deal now felt naive. 2 weeks ago, in a preliminary due diligence meeting, he had spotted a catastrophic flaw in the Sterling's supply chain integration plan. It was a rookie mistake, an oversight in logistical modeling that would have cost the new joint venture hundreds of millions in the first year alone. His first instinct was to flag it right there in the meeting, to demonstrate his superior acumen. But the room was already tense. Alistair Sterling had been dismissive of his team's concerns, and Tristan was openly scrolling through his phone, bored. To publicly correct them would have been seen as an insult, a challenge. It would have jeopardized everything. So, he chose a different path. He went back to his office that night and personally rewrote the entire logistics framework. He spent 6 hours coding a new model, creating a solution that was not only efficient but scalable. It was elegant, powerful, and undeniable. He then packaged the entire thing into a clean, anonymous-looking report, stripped of his personal coding signatures, and had one of his junior liaisons forward it to her counterpart at Sterling Industries. Just frame it as a thought experiment from our analytics department, he had instructed. No names attached. Let's see what they do with it. He had hoped it would be a quiet, effective way to fix the problem without bruising any fragile egos. A way to prove that his focus was on the success of the venture, not on personal glory. What a fool he had been. The very next day, an internal memo was circulated from Alistair Sterling's office. It praised the groundbreaking logistical paradigm developed by his son, Tristan. It lauded Tristan's visionary foresight and unparalleled business instincts. Tristan, who likely wouldn't know a logistical model from a fashion model, was being hailed as a genius for a plan he couldn't even read, let alone create. Julian felt a cold fury settle in his stomach. It wasn't just that they were thieves. It was the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. They hadn't just stolen his work, they had flaunted it, assuming the anonymous creator was some low-level drone they would never have to acknowledge. They believed competence was something you could simply claim, like a piece of property. That was the moment the last of his illusions about this partnership had crumbled. He wasn't dealing with business rivals. He was dealing with feudal lords who believed in their divine right to rule and to take whatever they wanted. His attempt to work from the shadows, to be the silent, competent partner, had been a complete failure. It had only emboldened them. It had taught them that he was a resource to be plundered, not a force to be respected. Now, standing in the ballroom, the weight of the permit freeze pressing down on him, he understood the full scope of their strategy. The stolen credit was a test. The permit freeze was a leash, yanking him into line before he even signed the contract. And Tristan's public humiliation of him was the final turn of the screw, a casual display of dominance meant to remind him of his place. He felt a vibration in his pocket and pulled out his phone again. It was another text, this time from his mother's sister, his Aunt Carol. Just drove past the site. Honey, the crews are packing up. What's going on? People are starting to ask questions. The squeeze was tightening. The news of the shutdown would spread through the community like wildfire. The hope he had so carefully cultivated would curdle into suspicion, then despair. They would think he had failed them. Or worse, that he had lied to them. He looked at his father's watch, its cracked crystal catching the light of the chandeliers. The hands were still, just as they had been for 20 years. But for the first time, Julian felt like his own time was running out. Tristan Sterling was now holding court near the stage, a microphone in his hand. He was telling a crude story, and the sycophants around him were braying with laughter. At one point, he gestured vaguely in Julian's direction. And you know, we're all about diversity these days. Gotta check those boxes, right? He said into the mic, a sloppy, knowing wink directed at his friends. The remark, though not aimed directly at him, landed like a punch. It was the casual dismissal of his entire life's work, reducing him to a token, a checkbox on a corporate diversity form. Every late night, every sacrifice, every brilliant line of code he'd ever written was erased by that one lazy, bigoted comment. Julian's hand clenched around his phone. He could feel the delicate electronics straining under the pressure. He had come here tonight prepared to compromise, to swallow his pride for the greater good. He had been willing to play their game, to endure their condescension, to be the bigger man. But this was no longer a game of egos. This was an attack on his mother's legacy. It was an attack on his community's future. It was an attack on the very core of his identity. He had built his empire by being smarter, faster, and more disciplined than anyone else. He had always believed in the power of logic and strategy over brute force. He had avoided open conflict, preferring to win by making himself indispensable. But the Sterlings didn't value indispensability. They only understood dominance. They didn't respect intellect. They only respected power. He had been trying to win a chess match against opponents who were just knocking the pieces off the board. A quiet calm settled over him, the kind of stillness that comes before a hurricane. The rage and humiliation receded, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. He had tried to do this their way. He had tried to be polite. He had tried to be discreet. It was time to do it his way. The great hall was filled with the sound of polite applause as Alistair Sterling took the stage. The old man stood at the podium, bathed in a warm, golden spotlight, the very picture of patriarchal benevolence. He adjusted his microphone, his movements slow and deliberate, a king surveying his court. Thank you, he began, his voice a low, gravelly hum that commanded attention. It is a wonderful evening, made all the more wonderful by the history we are about to make. Julian watched from the wings, his heart a steady, cold drum against his ribs. He had moved from the shadows, positioning himself for what was to come. He was no longer hiding. He was waiting. For generations, Sterling Industries has been a pillar of American industry. Alistair continued, his speech a well-rehearsed litany of self-congratulation. We have built cities, forged steel, and powered a nation. But tradition, as we all know, must be married to innovation. The future is not something that happens to you. It is something you build. Julian had to admit, the old man was a master of performance. He spoke of progress and forward-thinking while embodying the very essence of stagnation. And that is why this partnership is so vital. With Nexus Innovations, we are not just stepping into the future. We are acquiring it. The choice of words was not lost on Julian. Acquiring, not partnering, not collaborating. Alistair saw him as a commodity. This success, this bold vision, would not be possible without the next generation of leadership. My son, Tristan. Alistair beamed, gesturing toward his son, who stood near the front of the stage, preening under the adulation. Tristan gave a slight, regal bow, as if he were accepting a crown. Tristan's work on the logistical framework for this merger has been nothing short of revolutionary. Alistair boomed. His genius will save this new entity billions and set a new standard for the industry. The lie, so brazen and public, hung in the air. Julian saw some of the Nexus board members in the audience shift uncomfortably. They knew the truth. They knew whose work it really was. But they remained silent, caught in the web of the moment. And now, Alistair said, his voice reaching a crescendo, The moment we've all been waiting for. The signing of the contract that will forge Sterling Nexus into a global powerhouse. I would like to invite Mr. Julian Vance to the stage to join me. All eyes turned to Julian. The spotlight found him, and for a moment, he was pinned in its glare. He could feel the weight of hundreds of expectations, the silent questions, the pity, the condescension. He walked toward the stage, his steps even and measured. He did not hurry. He did not smile. He projected an aura of absolute calm, a man walking into a boardroom, not a lion's den. He reached the grand mahogany table set up on the stage, where the thick, leather-bound contract lay open. A single, ornate fountain pen rested beside it. Alastair Sterling stood on one side, a practiced smile plastered on his face. But before Julian could reach the table, Tristan stepped in front of him, blocking his path. He was holding a cheap ballpoint pen, the kind with a corporate logo printed on the side. He offered it to Julian with a theatrical flourish. "Here you go, pal," Tristan said, his voice amplified by the podium microphone he had leaned into. "Don't want you getting ink on your fingers from that fancy one." The crowd chuckled. It was a small sound, but in the cavernous hall, it echoed like a wave of disrespect. Tristan leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, but one he knew the mic would still catch. "Just sign on the dotted line, champ. We'll handle the complicated parts from here." And that was it. The final, unforgivable insult. The public, recorded, undeniable confirmation of everything he had endured. It was the perfect crystallization of their prejudice, the assumption that he was simple, that he was out of his depth, that he was a prop in their grand ceremony. Julian stopped. He looked at the cheap pen in Tristan's hand. He looked at Tristan's smug, triumphant face. Then, his eyes scanned the room, past the laughing faces, and settled on a small group of people standing near the back. The delegation from Shanghai. Mr. Chun, the chairman of one of China's largest tech investment firms, stood with his team. They were the silent partners in this deal, the ones providing a huge secondary round of funding that the Sterlings desperately needed to finance the acquisition. Julian had met with them privately last week. They were sharp, serious men who valued respect and precision above all else. Right now, they looked deeply uncomfortable. They had witnessed the entire, ugly display. An idea, cold and brilliant, formed in Julian's mind. He did not take the pen from Tristan. Instead, he stepped around him and walked directly to the podium, gently moving Alastair Sterling to the side. The old man was so surprised by the move that he simply stumbled back, his smile faltering. Julian tapped the microphone. The feedback squealed for a second, silencing the room. "Good evening," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying a new, hard authority that cut through the ambient noise. "I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding." A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Tristan's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "I'd like to begin by thanking the Sterling family for their interest in my company," Julian said, letting the word interest hang in the air, freighted with meaning. He then turned his body slightly, directing his next words toward the back of the room. He switched from English to the most flawless, formal Mandarin Julian had ever spoken. "Chun Shansheng, Wan Song Hak. Wa Shi Wang Nin He Nin De Tong Shimun Nung Yunlang Jinwan Zhichang Nao Jir." He began, his tone respectful but firm. "Mr. Chun, good evening. I hope you and your colleagues can forgive the farce that has taken place tonight." A collective gasp went through the room. The Chinese delegation straightened up, their eyes wide with surprise and dawning respect. Alastair and Tristan Sterling exchanged a panicked look. They had no idea what he was saying. They were completely, utterly lost. Julian continued in Mandarin, his voice ringing with clarity and confidence. "Ninkernung Mayo Yi Sudao, Zai Woman Furtend of Fulu Chi, Dishar Tao Zhong, Yo Yi Shang Tao Kan, Shi Zhanmun Wei Ninfa Ninda Tu, Ar Sodub. Zhi Shang Tao Kan Guri Ding, Zai Joy Zhong Chan Su Chandag Arshifisha Shernari, Nexus Innovations Yongyo, Danfang Man Zhongzhi Shi De Chenbu Chenli, Wushi, Liao. Zhishu Weila Baohu Woman Song Fong de Li Yi, Yi Fong Chu Shan, Bu Dao De De Xingwei. You may not be aware, but in Appendix 7, Article 12 of our contract, there is a clause written specifically for you and your investment. This clause states that within the 24 hours prior to the final signature, Nexus Innovations has the full, unilateral right to terminate the agreement for any reason, without cause. This was to protect our mutual interests in the event of any unethical behavior. Mr. Chen's impassive face broke into a slow, knowing smile. He nodded slightly at Julian. He understood perfectly. It was a failsafe, a poison pill, hidden in plain sight, and the Sterlings had been too arrogant or too lazy to have that section properly translated and vetted. They had assumed it was just boilerplate. Furthermore, Julian went on, still in Mandarin, the logistical framework that Mr. Alistair Sterling praised so highly was, in fact, my own creation. I have the original timestamped files and server logs to prove it. It was submitted anonymously to prevent exactly this kind of dishonest grandstanding. He saw the blood drain from Alistair's face. The patriarch couldn't understand the words, but he could understand the tone. He could see the rapt attention of Mr. Chun. He knew, instinctively, that he had lost control. Julian now turned back to the audience, switching back to English, his voice like ice. "The deal," he said, looking directly at Alistair, "as you understand it, is a fiction. The partnership you have described tonight is built on a foundation of deceit and disrespect." He pulled out his phone. The entire room was silent, every person holding their breath. He found the contact for his chief financial officer, Helena. He put the call on speakerphone. It rang once. "Helena," a crisp voice answered. "Helena, it's Julian," he said, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "Terminate Project Sterling. Effective immediately. Liquidate any joint holdings and execute Clause 7 to 12. The deal is off." "Confirmed, Julian," Helena replied without hesitation. "Termination protocols initiated." Julian hung up. He let the silence stretch, a deafening void where the Sterling's triumph was supposed to be. He looked at Tristan, whose face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked at Alistair, who seemed to have aged 20 years and 20 seconds. On the large screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the Sterling Nexus Partnership logo, a live news feed suddenly popped up. A reporter in the room was already broadcasting. The cheering at the bottom of the screen was stark. $12B Sterling Nexus deal collapses live at gala. The stock ticker for Sterling Industries, displayed in the corner of the screen, turned from green to a deep, bloody red as after-hours trading reacted to the news in a panic. It was a complete and utter catastrophe. Public. Humiliating. Irreversible. Julian Vance had not raised his voice. He had not hurled insults. He had simply spoken the truth in a language his enemies did not understand and made a single, decisive phone call. He had erased their dynasty with a whisper. In the stunned, tomb-like silence of the ballroom, a new sound emerged. It was the sound of expensive leather shoes on marble, approaching the stage with purpose. Mr. Chun and his delegation walked through the paralyzed crowd, their faces resolute. They ignored the sputtering, apoplectic Sterling family and stopped directly in front of Julian. Mr. Chun bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect. "Mr. Vance," he said in perfect English, his voice resonating with authority. "That was the most impressive display of corporate integrity I have ever witnessed. My firm does not do business with fools or thieves." He gestured dismissively toward the Sterlings. "But we are very interested in doing business with visionaries." He extended his hand. "My partners and I would like to propose a new deal. A direct partnership between your company and ours. No middlemen. We are prepared to offer $2 billion for a smaller equity stake than the Sterlings were to receive." The offer hung in the air, a thunderclap in the wake of the storm. It was nearly double the value, on vastly better terms. It was not just a victory, it was a coronation. Julian looked at Chen's outstretched hand. He thought of the half-built community center, of the kids waiting for scholarships, of his mother's dream. He thought of his father's watch and the value of time well spent. He had come here tonight willing to negotiate from a position of weakness, to accept disrespect as the price of progress. Now, the entire board had been flipped. He was no longer a player in their game. He was the one who owned the entire casino. He did not take Chen's hand immediately. "Mr. Chun," Julian said, his voice steady and calm, "I appreciate the generous offer, and I accept it, on 2 conditions." Chen raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "First," Julian stated, his gaze sweeping across the room, ensuring every reporter and every powerful guest heard him clearly. Your firm will issue a public statement before the markets open tomorrow, detailing the unethical behavior and fraudulent claims made by Sterling Industries that led to the dissolution of our initial agreement. The world needs to know that integrity is not negotiable. Chin smiled. Consider it done. We do not like our name associated with such amateurism. Second, Julian continued, his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its steel. $100 million of the initial investment will be transferred directly to the Vance Initiative Foundation account within 24 hours. My community has waited long enough. This was not a business negotiation anymore. This was a declaration. He was using his newfound power not just for himself, but to immediately fulfill the promise that had driven him here in the first place. He was leveraging his victory for the people he had sworn to protect. Mr. Chin's smile broadened. He finally clasped Julian's hand, his grip firm and decisive. Mr. Vance, he said with genuine admiration, you are a rare breed. It will be an honor to be your partner. With the deal sealed, Julian turned his attention one last time to the ruins of the Sterling family. Alistair was being helped into a chair by an aide, his face ashen. Tristan stood frozen, his face a grotesque mixture of rage and humiliation. He looked at Julian with pure, unadulterated hatred. He opened his mouth to say something, to curse him, to salvage a shred of dignity. But no words came out. He was irrelevant, a ghost at his own execution. Julian simply held his gaze for a moment, then gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of triumph or of pity. It was a gesture of dismissal. Then, he turned and walked off the stage, Mr. Chun and his team falling into step beside him, already talking animatedly about the future. He didn't look back. 6 months later, the view from Julian Vance's office was breathtaking. It encompassed the entire city, from the gleaming steel and glass towers of the financial district to the sprawling, vibrant neighborhoods that fed the city's soul. His office was no longer in the modest building where Nexus had started, but occupied the top 3 floors of the newest, most advanced skyscraper downtown, the Nexus Tower. The space was minimalist and modern, a reflection of its occupant. The only object on his vast, polished concrete desk was a small, elegant stand. On it rested his father's old, steel-cased watch. Its crystal was still cracked, its hands forever frozen at the moment his father's time had run out. It was a reminder not of an end, but of a beginning. It was the fuel. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping a cup of coffee. He was no longer just the CEO of a tech company. He was a force. The partnership with Chin's conglomerate had been more successful than either of them had imagined. Their joint ventures were dominating the market, pushing the boundaries of artificial intelligence and sustainable energy. He was on the cover of every major business magazine, hailed as the new face of ethical capitalism. But his true victory lay far below the glittering skyline. He looked down toward the neighborhood where he had grown up. In its heart, a new building gleamed, a beacon of hope and modernity. The Sarah Vance Community Center was open. It housed the free clinic his mother had dreamed of, a state-of-the-art tech lab for local kids, and a business incubator designed to foster new startups from within the community. He had not just built a building. He had planted a garden in a desert. The Vance Initiative, flush with capital and his unwavering focus, was transforming the city. He had established a new venture capital fund, the Northwood Fund, specifically to invest in minority and women-led startups, bypassing the biased, exclusionary system of traditional VC firms. He was actively poaching the best and brightest minds who had been overlooked or dismissed by companies like Sterling Industries, creating a powerhouse of diverse talent that was the envy of the corporate world. He had healed the system not by joining it, but by building a better one beside it, making the old one obsolete. A notification chimed on his tablet. It was an alert from a news service he subscribed to, one that tracked the fortunes or misfortunes of his former adversaries. He picked it up and read the brief article. Sterling Industries was no more. After the public humiliation and the catastrophic stock collapse, the company had entered a death spiral. Alistair Sterling, broken and disgraced, had been forced into a fire sale of its assets, piece by piece, just to satisfy its creditors. The once mighty empire had been dismantled and sold for parts. Alistair had retired to a secluded estate, never to be seen in public again. And Tristan? The article had a small, almost pathetic update on him. After being blacklisted from every major corporate board in the country, his name now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, Tristan Sterling had been found managing a struggling luxury watch boutique in a second-tier shopping mall. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who couldn't tell time, who had wasted all of his, was now reduced to selling it to strangers. Julian closed the tablet. He felt no pleasure, no schadenfreude. He only felt a quiet sense of finality. The Sterlings were a relic of a bygone era, a fossilized reminder of a system built on arrogance and exclusion. Their downfall wasn't his victory. It was an inevitable consequence of their own blindness. He picked up his father's watch, its familiar weight a comfort in his palm. He had spent so much of his life running from his past, trying to outrun the ghost of his father's fate, trying to build walls of success so high that no one could ever touch him. But now he understood. His past was not a weight to be shed. It was an anchor. It was the source of his strength, his empathy, his unyielding drive for justice. He had not erased his past. He had redeemed it. The intercom on his desk buzzed. Mr. Vance, his assistant's voice came through. The first group of Northwood Fund recipients are here to see you. Julian smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. Send them in, he said. He placed his father's watch back on its stand, a silent guardian watching over a new and better future, and turned to welcome the next generation of dreamers he had sworn to empower. The work was not finished. It was just beginning.